Welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and a couple of weeks ago we had the chance to talk to Haley and Julie from the original Bug Shirt Company, and since then, it's now mid-May. We are in the thick of black fly season, as I'm sure some of you who have been out in the bush the last couple of days can attest to. And this week we are talking about another insect, though this one is a little bit not as intrusive, not as in your face about it, but just as nasty and honestly more nasty. And we're talking about ticks. And of course, ticks that carry Lyme disease. And that was something that happened to our guest today, where he unfortunately contracted Lyme disease from a tick bite, had to deal with the medical fallout, had to deal with the medical stigmas and systems that kind of follow around Lyme disease. And so he decided to change his career, to start a business, and even though he was in science before, to focus himself on making sure people don't go through that same kind of issue that he went through, and to make sure that people have a place where they can send off their ticks to get properly tested for all of these different things for peace of mind, and just to know that if you want to deal with this, even if there are symptoms that actually develop, that you can deal with it. So really, really cool story that we have for you today. So let's get right into it. But first, a word from today's lead sponsor, Agnico Eagle.
At Agnico Eagle, we are committed to being a trusted community partner, focusing our efforts on building a local economy that lasts for generations. Our careers offer the flexibility and ample downtime needed to find lifelong balance. We strive to be a good neighbor, investing in our people and their future, not just because we operate here, but because this is home. We make mining work.
So today on the program, we are pleased to be joined by the CEO and founder of Geneticks, which you can find at Geneticks.ca, Justin Wood. And Justin, you are also a staff scientist. You have a really long title, so I'll let you kind of say that one, but welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah. And the other title is staff scientist at the G. magnata Lyme Disease Research Laboratory at the University of Guelph.
What a mouthful.
That's a good segue, because Lyme disease, over the years, but a few weeks ago I did a story on black flies, mosquitoes, and ticks. Years and years ago, we weren't thinking about ticks, and we weren't thinking about Lyme disease. And then when I interviewed Mary Beth Pfeiffer, who wrote the book Lyme Disease a few years back, brought a great deal of awareness. And Justin's the perfect, I think, I guess I don't want to call him a role model, but he's a perfect example of what can happen and what you can do about it and everything else in between. So I think we'll just start off, Justin, just tell us what Lyme disease is, because you'll eventually go into your segue in that you were affected by it. But let's tell people what Lyme disease is, because it masquerades itself when you try to diagnose it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really simple answer and a really complicated answer to this. So the simple answer is Lyme disease is bacterial infection caused by the bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi. It's vectored by ticks, so for the most part, and there are a couple other methods. This is where it gets complicated, but its main way that you can get it is being bit by a tick that's infected with that bacteria. And the disease itself is a very complicated one because the symptoms can be very, very diverse. The manifestations of the disease can be very, very diverse. So my experience with Lyme disease could be completely different from another person's experience with Lyme disease. So the simple answer is it's a bacterial infection caused by this particular bacteria that is generally vectored by ticks. The more complicated answer is when we talk about Lyme disease sort of colloquially. Often people aren't just talking about that infection with that bacteria. They're talking about a whole co-host of other infections that can come along with being bitten by a tick. So ticks don't just carry the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. They carry bacteria that causes anaplasmosis, babesiosis, can cause Powassan virus. There's a whole bunch of what we would consider opportunistic infections that somebody who's suffering from Lyme disease might experience as well. And a lot of that tends to get lumped into this colloquial idea of Lyme disease. And that can make it really, really difficult to treat because you may think, okay, this person's infected. We know what the bacteria is. We can get rid of that and they'll be fine. And often the experience is much, much more complicated than that. They may be suffering from a number of other things. It all gets lumped under this Lyme disease umbrella. And it just becomes very, very difficult for people to get out of this like bog of symptoms and illnesses that they're experiencing. And a lot of people that get in there, they have a lot of trouble getting back out.
Well, you experienced a great deal of trouble. Now, I'm not sure if you knew exactly when you were bitten, but you became debilitated by during the course of a time whenever you were bitten.
Yeah. I don't know exactly when I was bitten, but I had a lot of exposure. I used to plant trees in the summer when I was in university. So I was always, out in the outdoors being bitten by all sorts of things. I did a lot of hiking, a lot of mountain biking, that sort of thing. So I had a lot of opportunity for exposure. And I also did my undergrad at Queen's University in Kingston, which has, always been a hotbed for ticks and Lyme disease. I had a lot of exposure. I never actually found any ticks embedded or feeding on me, but that's actually quite common with Lyme disease patients is a lot of people don't find the ticks, particularly if you're bitten by a nymphal tick, which is sort of the juvenile stage. They're really, really small. So even if they attach to you for a couple days and they engorge, they're starting off the size of a poppy seed. And, how are you expected to find that, especially if you're not being vigilant for that kind of thing?
Yeah, and then of course after that, well, tell us about how debilitated you actually became, and how long of that that you were sidelined, I guess.
Yeah, it was a long time. The saga started for me probably in around 2011, and I was at the University of Calgary at the time. I was doing my master's. I was playing on the varsity soccer team, and prior to this, actually, even before this, this is probably relevant. I had started to get a lot of like migratory joint pain, and this was probably, let's say, 2009, 2010. And I thought because I was an athlete, maybe I was overusing some of my limbs and experiencing a lot of pain. And I had gone to like physio and seen the sports physician associated with the team, and had various diagnoses about muscle problems and joint problems and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and then you were, you were an athlete at the University of Calgary, and what were the first symptoms that kind of came across?
Yeah, so for me, what happened was I had sustained a concussion in a soccer game. And instead of it resolving itself in the sort of typical course of time, I ended up having about 3 to 4 months of symptoms that didn't go away. And eventually that resolved, and I was okay for a couple of months after that. And then I had a small, really quite innocuous head injury that caused even more chaos. And over the next couple of years, I just had this slow sort of descent of neurological symptoms. And because my first one was concussion related, I was stuck in the medical system in this idea that I was suffering from post-concussion syndrome or persistent post-concussion syndrome, they said. And it wasn't really making sense because I was getting worse and I wasn't having more injuries, but I was getting sicker, and it was becoming less of just a neurological thing. I had really severe neurological issues, headaches, brain fog, debilitating pain, inability to concentrate, to listen to music, watch TV shows, read, spend time with people. I had these just overwhelmingly intense neurological symptoms, and then they started to spread to the rest of my body. I was having myalgias, muscle pain. I was having heart palpitations and heart issues, digestive issues. It became such a diffuse thing that almost every system in my body was affected. And over the course of probably 2 or 3 years, I went from this being a very active athlete, academic, to being unable to work. I was unable to walk. I wasn't able to take care of myself. People had to help me do pretty much every task throughout the day. I could hardly leave my room. Just increasingly debilitating. And answers were just not coming. I was being bounced around the medical system from neurologists to physiatrists to you name the specialty. I'd been there. I probably saw at least 20 to 30 doctors, and nobody had any idea what was going on. And so it just became increasingly desperate over time, as you can imagine.
Well, that's a crazy health story, and of course, then you came out of it. How did you finally get diagnosed? Like, what was that aha moment?
Yeah, it was a really interesting one. I had been hearing about through friends of friends kept saying, "Oh, well, I knew this person and they had Lyme disease and it was really severe." And I kept saying, as silly as it sounds retrospectively, I may be sick, but at least I don't have Lyme disease. It was kind of my saving grace, because I had heard about how severe Lyme disease was and how difficult it was to treat. And then I was at I went to a naturopath clinic because I was really searching for any sort of resolution to the unabating symptoms that I was experiencing. And I was sitting there with all of these patients that were being treated for Lyme disease. And I was looking around thinking, wow, they look a lot like me. So I asked the naturopathic doctor, I said, do you think this could be Lyme disease? And they said, it's possible. Sometimes it manifests neurologically, which I've come to understand is actually more common than people might think. And so we did the testing and it came back positive, and it kind of sort of blew my mind. I remember it taking multiple days before the reality of that diagnosis sunk in. At first, I was kind of like, wow, I know what's going on. And then there was this sort of numb period of 3 days. And then it felt like the whole thing just sort of crashed over me. And I realized, okay, there's going to be a lot of difficulty getting out of this now that I understand what's actually going on.
And how did you get out of it?
Yeah, I mean, that was probably the bigger challenge of the whole thing was, particularly at the time, there wasn't a lot of support for Lyme disease. I mean, you mentioned in the beginning the idea that the awareness of Lyme disease is growing. And so this was in 2015. I got this diagnosis in 2015. And at the time, the idea around Lyme disease was that it's rare, it's difficult to catch, and it's easy to treat. And so I went to my primary care physician. I said, I have been diagnosed with Lyme disease, and that's, what explains this. And he says, okay. He gave me a 1-month course of doxycycline, which is an antibiotic used often to treat Lyme disease. I took it for a month, and I was improving. And then I went back to him when the course was done, and he said, well, that's all you need. Any symptoms you have now are not related to the infection. They're just unrelated symptoms that you'll have to deal with. And I thought, that doesn't really make sense. I've been being treated for 1 month. I'm clearly improving. And, how can you just say that's it? You're not going to get any better. So I sort of bounced around from there, and some other doctors were willing to prescribe longer courses of antibiotics. I kept improving on that until some sort of rare side effects hit me, and I got really sick from those. So I had to stop those antibiotics and started bouncing around looking for new treatments. And it took another, I think, probably 2 full years before I found a treatment that really worked for me, which was these injectable high-dose penicillins called Bicillin. And that was sort of the turning point for me. I started that treatment, and it was like all of these symptoms that I had been experiencing for 4 to 5 years now started to wash away. And once that started, that actually started the sort of next phase of healing, which was I'd been in this incredibly sick state for years now. And so my body was really beat up. You can imagine if you have a multi-system illness that targets kind of everything happening in your body, and that's been going on for over 5 years, everything is in bad shape. So there was still another probably 3+ years of recovery from there, of just slowly kind of getting healthy again before I even started to feel like it was possible to feel like I did prior to getting sick, let alone actually getting there. So really, really difficult, painful course to get there. And a lot of these treatments, they feel, because of the way the bacteria responds to treatments, there's something called the Jarisch-Herxheimer reaction. And it means that when you treat, you actually feel worse. You get much, much sicker every time you take a dose of antibiotics. It's a really, really brutal treatment period for a lot of people. So it's not only that you get sick and you suffer, then when you start treating, you have to go often through, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, this really, really painful, really debilitating treatment. A lot of people consider it similar to sort of chemotherapy in the way that it makes you feel when
I
you
was
take
just
it.
going to say that. But I was counting on my fingers. Like, is this about 8 years?
Yeah, I mean, from start to when I actually started to feel better, if we put the start date at 2011, I don't think I started to feel even remotely better or find a treatment that worked at all until late 2017. And then I wouldn't say that I felt there's probably another 2 or 3 years after that. So yeah, it could be 8 to 10 years.
I was going to say
before.
now it's a decade. I added 2 more fingers to that count. And at the same time, life goes on, and you're a scientist and you're doing academics. And then tell us how the transition to founding, and you are the CEO, but the founder of Geneticks.ca. And of course, I said earlier, Geneticks.ca, but both work. But how did you come to that? I mean, when I tell stories sometimes, I say it's just a series of connecting the dots. And in you're a perfect example of connecting dots from, wow, I had Lyme disease and now I'm going to do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, as you can imagine, if you're, somebody that likes to be doing things in life and you get really sick and you can't, you're sidelined, there's a real antsiness to get back into life when you start to feel better. So I probably even jumped the gun a little bit on when I was actually ready to start. But basically what happened was before I got sick, I was doing my master's in something called functional genomics. So molecular biology, biochemistry, that kind of thing. So I had these lab skills, and I was accepted to a PhD program that I never got to start. So I was really keen to get back into that sort of thing. And as I was going through the treatment, I was connecting with a lot of like doctors and advocates, and because of my background, there was a lot of really positive conversations going on about what needed to happen in the Lyme disease space. So when I started to get better, I had this idea of, okay, I really want to jump back in. I want to be impactful in the sense of I just went through this horrible thing, and I don't want other people to have to go through that. I have a somewhat unique skill set and experience to have gone through this really debilitating process, have the education and the experience to understand it in a way that your average person going through it won't. And then a really unique opportunity to do something impactful just based on the skills that I had acquired previous to this and then had this experience. So I had thought originally maybe I'd like to go right back into research and maybe I could do a PhD or something. But I thought, okay, you've been sick for years. You haven't worked since 2014. It's been 4 years. That's probably a pretty ambitious goal. So in my naivety, I thought, well, what if I just started a company? That's got to be easier than doing a PhD. And I talked to a number of healthcare practitioners that I was working with, and I said, this is kind of what I'm thinking of doing. I've noticed that there's not a really strong program for people if they've been bitten by a tick to determine what that tick was carrying. And I thought, if this happens to me again, the first thing I want to know is if that tick is carrying the bacteria that causes Lyme disease or a number of other diseases, because then I can know what I need to do next. So I mentioned that to a couple of practitioners, and they said, yeah, that would be really great. And as I started to pursue this idea, I would come up against, a barrier, and just through some connection I had made, we would find a way around it. I would say, oh, I was thinking about doing this, but then I came up against this problem. Somebody will, I can help you solve that. So through some degree of serendipity, this thing came together. And probably, I don't know, 6 months to a year after having this idea, I kind of put together enough things to start the company in its really basic format, which at the time we were just testing for ticks just for Lyme disease. That's all we were doing. And it was kind of like a proof of concept. Okay, is there demand for this? Can we do it in a way that we can sustainably make money and support this company while also providing this service to people in a meaningful way? And we said, okay, yes, we can do that. So then we started to expand. Okay, we need to do additional pathogens because, like I mentioned, it's not just Borrelia burgdorferi. Ticks can carry pathogens that cause anaplasmosis, babesiosis, whatever it is. So we started expanding, and then we got to the point where we were, now we're testing for up to 17 different tick-borne pathogens. And again, we started with just one, and now we can do up to 17, and we can do it in the same day that, the tick arrives at our lab. So if you sent us a tick today, you dropped it at our lab in the morning, we could tell you if it was carrying up to 17 different pathogens by the end of the day. And to us, that's this really, really important and critical thing, because if you've been bit by a tick, you don't actually have a lot of options for knowing if you've been infected. So you're sort of playing this wait and see game. And the wait and see game has really, really dire consequences, because if you wait and you don't get sick, that's fantastic. But if you wait and you do get sick, you're no longer in this ideal treatment window. You've moved past the early stages of the disease where it's easy to treat, and you've moved into the later stages of the disease where treatment's going to be difficult, your symptoms are going to be much more severe, and your chances of going through something like me or a lot of other people I know in the Lyme disease community have gone through are a lot higher. And that just felt, completely unacceptable. So we thought, okay, here's our best workaround for solving this problem as quickly as we can.
The snowmobile is parked. The ice is melted. And suddenly, all those batteries you ignored all winter are no longer working. The boat just won't start. The ATV's not cooperating. Even the golf carts decided it's taking the season off. That's where Battery North Bay comes in. Boats, ATVs, motorcycles, e-bikes, solar systems, cordless tools, even the kids' Power Wheels. If it runs on a battery, chances are we've got it in stock and ready to go. We're locally owned, proudly serving Northern Ontario, and we ship Canada-wide. Stop by 1315 Main Street West or call 705-478-5400. Battery North Bay, powered up for every season. It's almost that time of year. Early mornings at the rink, fresh notebooks and backpacks, and a community gearing up for another great season of varsity sports. At Source for Sports North Bay, we're proud to be part of it all. Whether it's finding your kid's first pair of skates, gearing up for tryouts, or outfitting your team for the season ahead, we've got you covered. Because here, we're not just a sports store, we're neighbors, coaches, teammates, and fans. And we're proud to cheer you on every shift, step, and stride of the way. Visit Source for Sports North Bay at 1321 Fisher Street and let us help you along your way.
I've said it in another Backroads Bill podcast interviewing scientists that scientists are rock stars and we don't know them. We know our basketball players and hockey players. It also reminds me too, like Banting and Bess and Pasteur and all these great scientists. I mean, you can call it a workaround if you will. But where I hang out at the Canadian Ecology Centre, right now we have MNR, wildfire forest firefighters, and I was telling them today I'm going to have a podcast on it. I said I'm going to be talking to you, and we talked a little bit about ticks. They said, and because of the changing climate by latitude, ticks are proliferating in different spots by latitude. And they told me, we're at certain places, and they used a couple places in, I think, near Dryden or Kenora, doesn't matter, is that at the end of the day, they've got to do the tick checks because they're pretty much covered, but it's around their necks and their heads, and they have to tick check each other. So you know what? I can't wait to get back to tell them that tonight. But Ben, I know you got a question.
Yeah, it's super fascinating listening to you guys talk about this stuff, because Lyme disease a little bit, it's not as, I would say, severe as something like rabies, but it kind of reminds me a lot of that, where you got to be careful, like you got to get it kind of early on.
Good comparison,
You don't really know if you've got it or not. But we're also in Northern Ontario, where it's obviously a lot of people go outside, and it's kind of when we're recording this is the same day the Bug Shirt episode's going out.
Yeah, well, that's how it started, right? We got to be covered up, and we talked about people need to wear bug shirts. Sorry.
So, I guess with the ticks and stuff, one of the things is the whole Bullseye. I believe that's Lyme disease, right, Justin? Where you have the Bullseye thing. So when you got bitten, for instance, I guess my big thing is how, if you're checking for yourself, does that always manifest? Maybe it doesn't manifest. Tell me a little bit about the whole Bullseye kind of rash that people get.
Yeah, for sure. I want to go back to two things first. One, I appreciate the comparison of scientists to rock stars. That's
Absolutely.
yeah.
You're
So
a
I
rock
appreciate you
star.
saying that. Oh, thank you. I wasn't just thinking for myself, but a lot of my colleagues and friends that spend a lot of time, working and don't get a lot of recognition. So I really appreciate that. And also to the comparison to rabies, because that's a comparison I make a lot to people, especially when we're talking about tick testing as a means to inform medical interventions, because it's very similar to rabies in the fact that you need to catch it early in order to have a good treatment outcome. Obviously, as you said, rabies is more severe because once you get symptoms, essentially there's nothing you can do. Lyme disease isn't quite that severe, and the outcome is not generally as fatal, but it's highly debilitating and it can be fatal. Um, but I use the comparison a lot because people say, well, why should I test the tick? And I say, well, if you were bit by a bat, and do you want to wait and see if you develop rabies, or would you want to test the bat to know if you've been exposed or not so you can have that early intervention? So I often make that exact same comparison with rabies. So I really appreciate that you brought that up. And then you were asking about tick checks and the bullseye rash and that sort of thing. And this is where it gets again interesting, is that the bullseye rash is a hallmark of Lyme disease. If you see the bullseye rash, and it's the true what we call erythema migrans, which is an expanding ring around the well, it doesn't have to be around the epicenter of the tick bite, but often it's around the epicenter of the tick bite. It usually happens a couple days after the bite. You see this expanding ring, and that's a hallmark of Lyme disease. If you see that, you can say almost unequivocally, I've been infected with Borrelia burgdorferi, I have Lyme disease, and that's a great marker to go treat. The problem is that does not happen in everybody that gets infected with Lyme disease. So just because you don't see the rash doesn't mean you weren't infected. And that opens up this whole new can of worms of, you've been bit by a tick, you remove it, there's no rash, you think, okay, I'm safe. And then months later, you're really, really sick and you're wondering why. So we have to be cautious with using signs and symptoms with diagnosing Lyme disease, because on the one hand, them not appearing doesn't mean you're not sick. And on the other hand, you may have some of the early signs and symptoms of Lyme disease are like feeling flu-like or migratory joint pain, Bell's palsy, things that can be caused by other things as well. So it's really difficult to make diagnoses based off of those things. So often what I tell people is you should be doing really thorough tick checks. So you're talking about these people that are out like fighting fires, they're covered head to toe. But if a tick attaches to somebody on their clothing outside, they're just going to keep walking around until they find access to skin. And if your only exposed part is around your head and neck, they're probably going to get up there, get into your scalp, behind your ears. Maybe they'll crawl into your suit. They'll find somewhere, generally a really vascular area. They tend to like armpits and that sort of thing, embed and start feeding. So we should be doing tick checks frequently and diligently, because we want to catch the ticks ideally before they bite. But if they do bite, we want to catch them early and remove them as quickly as possible. And then we can use that as our sort of branching point for what we do next. Once we remove that tick, okay, now what do we do? Because we want to know if we've been exposed not just to the tick, but what kind of pathogens. And that's where things get a little more difficult. If you have these really obvious signs and symptoms, like the bullseye rash appears, you're in great shape. I mean, you're in bad shape, but you're in great shape to do something about it. If it doesn't appear, then you're you're just kind of scratching your head wondering, have I been infected? Have I been exposed? What should I do next? That sort of thing.
Yeah. And one of the things that you said earlier, which I thought was kind of interesting, was when you were going through the initial, the phase period where you were getting treated and everything, there was almost like a stigma around Lyme disease, almost in a way where, maybe a doctor wasn't giving you the right diagnosis, or as you said, you weren't getting the right treatment. Do you think that is the conversation around Lyme disease, or maybe the education within the medical field and practice is changing around Lyme disease, and it has been, or is this a challenge that a lot of people are still facing today on a regular basis?
Well, and just before you answer that, Mary Beth Pfeiffer, she points the fingers at the pharmaceutical industry sometimes for that. But anyway.
Yeah, so it's actually both. At the time that I was diagnosed, it was much, much worse. I remember talking to my physician immediately about Lyme disease. He sort of had a blank look on his face and then didn't really know what to do with that. And when I would tell people at the time that I had been diagnosed with Lyme disease, I got a lot of really dismissive looks. And a lot of people would say, it was sort of looked at really heavily as pseudoscience at the time. And it was sort of considered almost like a psychological case more than an actual physiological illness. And incredibly frustrating. It's very, very difficult on the patients to be dismissed by their healthcare team that way. They're already very, very sick. They're already very, very vulnerable. And then the person that's supposed to help them comes in and says, oh, you're attention seeking, or this is psychological, this is psychosomatic. It's not real. All of the things that you're experiencing are just in your head. So it's really, really sort of brutal for people that are very sick to go through that. And it has improved a little bit since then. So it was over 10 years ago that this happened to me. Awareness has increased. Physicians have some degree of better training on it. They're more aware of it. They're more open to the idea of long-term manifestations of Lyme disease and like the late disseminated, stages of Lyme disease that we talk about as researchers and in the literature. But I know that patients are still not getting the care that they need and deserve around this. And that's leading to a lot of people traveling internationally in order to get treatment. It's leading to people looking to overseas laboratories to get diagnoses. And it's leading to a lot of people having to pay out of pocket for healthcare that should be covered by the Canadian healthcare system. So it has improved to a degree. It's not at the place where it needs to be to fully support the patients that are experiencing this. And from just a public perspective as well, not necessarily a healthcare perspective, the conversation around Lyme disease has changed dramatically as well. So if you were to walk down the street now and you would stop 10 random people, almost every single one of them would say, either I've experienced Lyme disease, or a friend or a family member has experienced Lyme disease, or somebody I know has experienced it, and it's really, really dramatically affected their life. Whereas 10 years ago, you wouldn't get that kind of response. Maybe one person would say, oh, yeah, I had a friend of a friend that had Lyme disease. Now it's become really, really pervasive. And I think that's what's driving some of the change around it is the general public is becoming so affected by this that they're almost demanding that things change. And I think that will help progress things to where they need to be, but we're certainly not there yet. And I still think we have quite a ways to go before we're in a place where I think people are getting the appropriate treatment for Lyme disease in an appropriate time frame. And they're not having to go through this sort of needless suffering that tends to accompany these sorts of situations in Canada.
Well, there's more advocacy to come, that's for sure. When you go on to Geneticks.ca, another thing, there's the maps, and that's important because they're confirmed sites. But the other thing I'd like to answer is how do they, and I want to take the answer back to these MNR wildfire forest fighters, how do you get the ticks to Geneticks.ca, like by FedEx, by Purelator? How do you, and what do you put in? I thought, okay, what do I have to do?
Yeah. We try to keep it really easy for people. So once you've removed the tick from yourself, you can put it into sealable Ziploc bag. If you have a plastic container like a pill bottle or something, you can put it in that as well. And then just drop it into an envelope. You can take it to Canada Post, you can take it to Courier, FedEx, Purelator, whatever it is, and send it to our laboratory. And then we do everything from there. So obviously you have to go through the website to register your test. Once that's done, you just put it in the mail and send it to us. Some people like to put them in the freezer first so that the ticks are dead when they're in the mail. And we prefer that as well. But it's not absolutely necessary. And again, once you've removed the tick and put it into a sealable container and drop it in the mail, that's the end of what you have to do. Everything else we do at the laboratory, we email the results back as soon as we have them.
Wow. Anything else you want to add just as we get close to the end here that we haven't covered, and Ben can put it in there?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing is you'd kind of touched on the the maps and the statistics that we put on our website. And that's something that we like to direct people to. It's a really great tool for knowing or sort of assessing what the risk in your area is. We have maps that you can look at. You can break them down by health unit, public health unit. So you can look in your local area. You can see what the percentage of ticks collected in the year before carried the pathogens that cause Lyme disease. You can look at the map and see where the positive and negative ticks came from. We have all of that information available, and we really urge people to use that as a tool to assess their risk and help inform staying safe out in the outdoors.
Well, I love maps, and when I go to Genetics.ca, spend a lot of time on the maps. And you know what I learned today, Ben, is that, and this goes for all scientists have a story, and here's a scientist has a story that matters. And thank you for being on the Backroads Bill podcast.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thanks for having me.
So big thank you to Justin for coming on the podcast to share a story. I think for me, I said this at the top, the most interesting part and the part that I learned in all of this was just the stigma that was around Lyme disease. I didn't realize that people had to go through this when they were in the medical system, of people not having doctors and medical professionals not believing you or thinking it's something in your head versus actually being an actual disease that is affecting you. Thank you so much for Justin for coming on again. You can check out his website, Geneticks, and I will have the link in the description below so that you can check it out. If you enjoyed this episode of the Backroads Bill podcast, you can find this episode and many more by going on to your favorite podcast platform. We're on Apple, Spotify, etc. The video version is on the North Bay Echo YouTube channel, and you can find everything on our website, northbayecho.ca. You can follow us on socials as well, on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, all under the moniker North Bay Echo. And that wraps things up for us here. Thank you so much again for watching and listening, and we'll see you again next Wednesday for yet another Backroads adventure.